So when Obregon came to power, there came to power with him a group of northern generals and politicians who began the work of economic and social reconstruction that Madero, Huerta, and Carranza were either unable or unwilling to achieve. They were of middle class or even lower class origins. Obregon had been a mechanic and a farmer. His successor, Calles, a school teacher. Both were products of a border region where the U.S. cultural influence was very strong and where capitalism and capitalist relations were more highly developed than any other part of Mexico. So Obregon and Calles thus possessed a pragmatic business mentality, as far removed from the revolutionary agrarian ideology of Zapata as it was from the very aristocratic reformism of Carranza. These men deliberately set out to lay the economic, political, and ideological foundations of a new Mexican national capitalism. Now, aware that the revolution had radicalized the masses and aware of the appeal of socialism and anti-imperialism to the workers on whose support they counted, Obregon and Calles employed a revolutionary rhetoric designed to mobilize popular support and conceal, frankly, how modest were the social changes that actually took place. In practice, the Obregonian program was revolutionary only by contrast with the reactionary conservative trend that characterized the last years of Carranza's rule. Far from promoting socialism, Obregon sought accommodation with all elements of Mexican society except the most reactionary clergy and landlords, the super-powerful hacendados and the church. He allowed exiles of the most varied political tendency to return to Mexico, and radical intellectuals rubbed shoulders with former cientificos in his government. Power was held by a ruling class of wealthy generals, capitalists, and landlords. Elections largely remained a farce. The president was a dictator who kept power by playing regional warlords and various factions against one another. Labor and the peasantry were the government's obedient clienteles, represented by a labor party and an agrarian party, whose leaders formed a part of the establishment and mediated between their clienteles and the all-powerful president. The agrarian party I just mentioned was headed during Obregon's presidency by Antonio Diaz Soto y Gama, and his party was interested in land redistribution. And frankly, Obregon regarded agrarian reform as a useful safety valve for peasant discontent. And doing that, he distributed some land to pueblos. But the process proceeded slowly, haltingly, and against the intense opposition of the hacendados and the church. Even after a village had received land, its prospect for success was poor, for the government failed to provide the peasants with seeds, implements, and adequate credit facilities or modern agricultural training. Such credit assistance as they received usually came from the government rural banks, which exercised close control over land use, intensifying the client status of the peasantry or from rural loan sharks, basically. So the Obregon land reform was neither swift nor thoroughgoing. By the end of his presidency, only some 3 million acres had been distributed among 624 villages, while 320 million acres still remained in private hands. Now, Obregon also encouraged labor to organize, for he regarded trade unions as useful for stabilizing labor-capitalist relations as an important bulwark of his regime. Frankly, his political base became the labor class, the unions. The principal trade union organization was I may butcher this here, the Confederación Regional Obrera Mexicana, known by the acronym of CROM, formed in 1918. Despite the rhetoric of its leaders about class struggle and freedom from the tyranny of capitalism, Marxist-sounding stuff, CROM was really about as radical as the American Federation of Labor, with which it maintained close ties. Its perpetual boss was Luis Morones, known for his flashy dress, diamonds, limousines. As the only labor organization sponsored and protected by the government, CROM had virtually official status. Despite this official protection, Morones' method of personal negotiation with employers yielded scanty benefits to labor. Wages barely kept pace with the rising cost of living. The main purpose of CROM was to provide a political base for Obregon. This policy of learning about and incorporating indigenous peoples into the national identity has a name, Indigenismo, or indigenism. And it has two uses in Latin America. It's used broadly. And the broader one is it's sort of a political ideology that emphasizes the relation between the nation-state and indigenous minorities. And most often means, more recently means the greater social and political inclusion of indigenous peoples. The second use of the term, and that's what we're really talking about in relation to this consolidation period of the Mexican Revolution, is using indigeneity to celebrate some aspects of indigenous cultural heritage, but primarily as a relic of the past. So Indigenismo was the expression of nostalgia for an imagined, folklorized figure of indigeneity. It was designed to create a national identity that celebrated indigeneity, but also overwhelmed national divisions. Paradox. It's both a celebration and an assimilation of indigeneity. So we're gonna honor the Indians, bring them in, incorporate them into one giant national identity, which frankly will subsume their ethnic identity. I mentioned the Obregon government's achievements in education. They were led by his brilliant young Secretary of Education, Jose Vasconcelos, convinced that the school was the most important instrument for unifying the nation, that, quote, to educate was to redeem, unquote. Vasconcelos was given ample budgetary support from Obregon and launched an imaginative program of cultural missions designed to bring literacy and health to primitive Indian villages. Hundreds of young, idealistic teachers went out to bring the gospel of sanitation and literacy to remote pueblos. Vasconcelos also founded teacher training colleges, agricultural schools, and other specialized schools. An achievement in which he took special pride was the publication of hundreds of classic works in cheap editions for free distribution in the schools. This new secular nationalist school provoked clerical anger, for it threatened to supplant the priest with the teacher as the guiding force of the Indian community and to replace the religious world outlook taught by the Catholic Church with a scientific, secular world outlook. The Church fought back with all means at its disposal. Some priests denounced secular education from their pulpits and threatened parents who sent their children to state schools with excommunication. As a result of this campaign, many teachers were attacked and some killed by fanatical villagers. I'm glad that's not true today. Despite this campaign, Obregon made no effort to implement Article 3 of the Constitution, which banned primary religious schools, because he believed that in the absence of enough resources on the part of the state, it was better that Mexican children receive instruction from priests than remaining illiterate. And the national secular education was at least growing. Now, the Catholic issue joined with other issues to cause Obregon difficulties in his relations with the United States. For 3 years, the United States government withheld diplomatic recognition from Obregon in an effort to force him to recognize that Article 27 of the Constitution should not apply to mineral concessions. This is the part about, Mexicans retaining the subsoil and the value of Mexican earth. Should not apply to the mineral concessions obtained by foreigners before 1917. Like Carranza, Obregon was willing to respect the principle of non-retroactivity, but refused to formalize it in a treaty. He considered that humiliating. However, in 1923, there was a growing threat of a counter-revolutionary coup to prevent the victory of Obregon's hand-picked successor, Plutarco Elias Calles, and Obregon promised to decide to compromise. Basically, right-wing elements, the church, hacendados, picked this guy, Adolfo de la Huerta, who had been a revolutionary and in fact was temporary interim president between Carranza's death and Obregon's election. But he was chosen to lead a new counter-revolutionary coup. And so Obregon decided he had to compromise. And Mexican diplomats signed an agreement which confirmed that Article 27 was not retroactive and agreed to pay compensation for damages to American property during the Revolution. The U.S. promptly then extended formal recognition to Obregon in August of 1923. And when the expected revolt broke out in December, the United States allowed Obregon to procure large quantities of war material. And together with the help of organized labor and peasant movements, this aid enabled Obregon to crush the uprising, which was supported by, again, reactionary landowners, clergy, and some elements of the military. And so on November 30th, 1924, Calles assumed the presidency of Mexico.